So let's say you've got your bassoon player playing and now they're sitting in your band room every day in class. So first of all, how do I help this bassoon player during rehearsal with the short time that I have to help individuals? And how do I help my bassoonist over the course of the whole year? Well, first of all, during rehearsal, keep in mind that playing bassoon can be kind of frustrating. In fact, if you've been trying to learn as you took this course, you've probably experienced a fair amount of frustration in one way or another. The most frustrating things for new bassoon students are usually fingerings or reeds. And sometimes they may not realize what it is exactly that's causing their problem, especially if it's reeds and they're younger. They don't really know what to look for. So make sure that you're keeping an eye on that bassoonist and seeing if they're really frustrated during band class. And if they are, go check on them and ask if they have a specific question. And you might consider maybe setting up a time after class to check out that student's reeds to make sure that they're functioning. One of the ways you can be really proactively helpful is that in your own score study time, take a look at that bassoon part, and now that you know your bassoon fingerings, right? Take a look at that bassoon part and see if there are any tricky alternate fingerings that a bassoon player needs to know in order to achieve their part. Take a look for younger players to see how often that bassoon is moving in the fourth line F range. Above and below is basically the break, right? Open F is that whisper key F on the fourth line F. So from there, if we go up, we have to do half holes right above that line, and down below, then we're down to our normal octave fingerings. But if we're going back and forth across that F line, the bassoon part can get a lot more difficult all at once. So not only do you want to make sure that you've given them help outside of class to understand the techniques involved there with half hole and flicking, but you want to proactively be aware of when that's actually going to come up in their literature, in their part, so that you can help them achieve that. It's also important to double check the high register fingerings are being done correctly. As you saw, when we worked on the high register, those fingerings are a little bit harder to remember, and they're not quite as clearly connected to each other as some of the other fingerings are. So since they don't have as neat of a pattern to help a student remember, sometimes they'll get some of the keys, but not all the keys. And they may just think that they're playing out of tune and do all kinds of other things to compensate for that. Help them use the correct high fingerings in rehearsal, and just look in your score and see which ones of those they're going to need to know, and you can look them up ahead of time if you've forgotten. Double check the seat strap. If you just have a chance to walk over and visually assess the student in the middle of class, double check that the seat strap is up on the front of the chair. Up here is where we want to see that seat strap coming out. So we know that that bassoon is up here forward, and I'm not having to pull my shoulder back just to play the keys. Okay, as we talked about a long time back, when the student slides back in the chair to relax during rehearsal, often their seat strap comes with them. So make sure that that seat strap is up at the front right corner and that they're sitting over pretty close to that side of the chair. They don't have to sit right in the middle. So check the seat strap. You also want to make sure that in general their posture is good. As with some instruments, there's a tendency to develop a lean with an instrument that itself is sort of leaning on you in an unbalanced way. So the student's going to have to build some muscles, but while that process is taking place, sometimes they're going to develop some weird posture habits, or they're going to be going to the reed instead of figuring out how to position that bassoon and bring it to them. Encourage them and tell them that there is time to figure out the correct position, and that they are expected to work that out on their own. But make sure that they're getting good tips from you, and just assure them that it's okay to spend a long time adjusting that seat strap to make sure that it's ready to go before class or even in the first few minutes of class. Don't make them feel like they have to be playing if they're really uncomfortable or they know that their bassoon is not fully adjusted. Keep an eye out for the bocal, which should be exiting the mouth at a sort of a horizontal or possibly slightly downward angle, and a little bit to the left is okay too. If that bocal has wandering during band, if it's moving a lot, or if it seems to be pointed to one side and they're having to go retrieve it side to side, That right hand can do a little bit of rotating of the bassoon to reposition the vocal, and then there's definitely some flexibility to actually pivot the vocal in the well so that the student can get the vocal in at the correct angle. That all goes together with good posture in the first place. So keep an eye on that vocal. Sometimes that's a big red flag that there's other posture problems going on, or they're holding the bassoon incorrectly. Now, let's talk about how to help your bassoonist over the course of the school year. One of the things we mentioned was reeds, and that can be really frustrating for a student who doesn't really know why their instrument isn't working the way it was working before. Reeds change not only from reed to reed, but also over time, a reed will break in, or a reed can slip, or other problems can come up with reeds, and a reed that was working one day may not work as well the next day. The best way to deal with this, aside from really understanding how to assess and adjust reeds on your own, is to have a really good reed source for that student. Help them get connected with a good source for reeds, whether that's a person who knows how to adjust store-bought reeds, maybe that person is you, or it could be a better source of handmade reeds, whether that's locally or online. So, finally, make sure that they have they've been told to carry the reed in their mouth so that they're not chipping reeds. You don't want to have to use that reed source more often than you would normally. If you keep chipping your reeds and you're buying a lot of reeds, that family support can start to fade a little bit. It gets really expensive really fast. Double check that their vocal seals and doesn't have dents or major dings in it. Any slight damage, as slight as it appears to the vocal, can make a huge difference just because of its position and where it's attached to the bassoon. If you have any doubts, take it to a bassoon specialist or bassoon repair person and ask them to evaluate the vocal. Make sure that your bassoon student has access to water and a good container to soak their reeds in when they get to class. Whether they need to find a sink in the room or whether they need to leave the room to find a source of water, they need that container during class. So maybe they can hit the water fountain on their way to the band room, but they need a good plan for accessing water and a good container to soak their reeds. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but make sure that they understand that they have time. Give them time to assemble and disassemble all the pieces of the bassoon and try to let them out in time to swab out their instrument and do all the necessary maintenance. They're only going to remember how to do that if they can do it each day, and they certainly won't do it if they're rushed out the door every time. So make sure that your bassoonist has time to get set up, assembled, and then disassemble and do maintenance at the end of class. It's a good idea to check in from time to time about any small aches or pains that the bassoon player is experiencing. At first, there's going to be some because the body tenses up a little bit when it's doing something new, and sometimes we over-tense areas that are just now strengthening to do this new activity. But over time, if you check with your bassoonist and you notice weekly you're hearing a complaint about the left hand aching, that's not something where you just want to wait for the hand to get stronger. You want to definitely sit down with that student and see if they're doing anything incorrectly and maybe help them get more of the weight onto that seat strap or onto their right thigh so that their hand doesn't hurt as much. You have to figure out what their issue is, but don't let your bassoon player live in pain and think that that's just the way it works when you play bassoon. Check on them. Listen to your bassoon player during rehearsal, meaning listen to their sound and see if they're making a good tone. Having high expectations for all your students, you know, is a huge deal. And it's especially important for your bassoon player that you let them know when they're playing with a pinched tone or when they're playing pretty out of tune. It doesn't have to be a harsh insult, but they need to know from you that they're expected to play with good tone and play in tune. Hopefully they're listening to the models that you suggest or that they've found on their own, but the reality is they may not know exactly whether they're making the sound you want, the correct bassoon sound, or whether they're making a mistake. So they need that feedback from you and that high expectation that, yes, I do expect you to play that note in tune. Use your ears and think about the air embouchure balance. Make sure that you have high expectations for those bassoon students. Make sure your bassoonist has and practices with a tuner. Teach them to put the tuner a little bit to the side and maybe not stare at the tuner all the time while they're playing, but just have it set off to the side while they're playing their music and occasionally look over and see whether a note is sitting on the center of the needle or whether it's really sharp or really flat. Make sure that they understand the ways that they can actually adjust that pitch by having a tuner as well. So when you're experimenting with air, or when you're playing on just the reed and the vocal, or you're learning alternate fingerings, make sure that bassoonist has a tuner that they can check to see what's happening. Their ears won't always tell them. Finally, bassoonists need to develop tone with long tones, and they need to learn how to hold those long tones really steady, which is challenging on a really flexible instrument like the bassoon. So have them play some long tones. Hopefully that's a part of the daily routine in your band class. But make sure that they're aware that their job during those long tones is to be as steady as possible and to play with as beautiful a tone as possible, which requires that good air embouchure balance. You also want to make sure that at some point you get them started developing their vibrato. That can make a huge difference in the future when they're wanting to play with a soloistic tone, or at some point they want to warm up that bassoon tone for a particular passageway, particular passage. It's pretty frustrating for a student to have to learn the vibrato technique right when they first need it. So get them started on it. Just let them know that it exists and give them a quick exercise that they can work on at home. And from time to time, you might check in and say, how's that vibrato going? So keeping these things in mind, you can help your bassoonist not only in rehearsal, especially by preparing ahead of time, like score steady. You can also help your bassoonist over the course of the whole year by checking in on them occasionally, making sure that they're not in pain, and making sure that they have everything that they need. So, good luck helping out your bassoonists. I hope that's important to you. It's important to me that you know how to help them out, and I wish you the best of luck.